So if you look at chapter 20 and verse 42, we see here, this is Jonathan and David. They give each other a final hug, and they are going to be separated. David's going to flee. He's fleeing for his life from King Saul. It says, and Jonathan said to David, go in peace for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So here we see David's on the run. And now here for the next several years, David is going to be fleeing for his life with his band of men, trying to not be caught, captured, and killed by King Saul. So we're going to take a look at lesson number 1 here, and that is follow the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Let's read the first 6 verses or so. Then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? David was not alone in the sense that there was nobody with him. There was a band of men with him, but there was nobody. David wasn't traveling with his normal company. He was not with King Saul's men. That alarmed the priest, and the priest knew right away something wasn't right. So that's why he was afraid that David was there. David said unto Ahimelech the priest, the king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee, and I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. That's not true. That's not what was going on. David was not on the king's business. Saul had no idea where David was. If he knew where he was, he would have killed him. So David is here. He's just scrambling. He's trying to get what he needs to get on the run from King Saul. We're going to see here he was looking for 2 things. He was looking for something to eat, and he was looking for a weapon to protect himself. Verse 3, now therefore, what is under thine hand? David's asking the priest. Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what is their present? And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under my hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. The only food that was there and available to King, it kind of reminds me of what happens to me, like at 9 o'clock, we put the kids to bed. It's been a long day, and especially Sunday night. Sundays and Wednesdays are just, for whatever reason, is when I get the craving for that evening binge eating, right? And you don't know what you want. What are you hungry for, babe? I have no idea, but I'm just going to start eating stuff until something tastes good, you know? So you're sitting there and you're just pulling the cupboards apart, you know, and you have a fridge and cupboards full of nothing to eat. And you're like, man, what sounds good? So you have a little of this, little of that. David's saying, do you got any bread? 5 loaves or whatever you got. What do you have? That's what David's asking. The priest says, we don't have anything except for the hallowed bread. It was food that was only supposed to be eaten from the table of showbread. It was only supposed to be eaten by the priest. And even then, it was only supposed to be eaten by the priest at a specific time, which was at the changing of the bread on the Sabbath day. So that bread was set aside very specifically for specific people at a specific time for a specific purpose. David answered the priest, verse 5, and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days, since I came out, and the vessel of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread on the day when it was taken away. God had given Israel a specific set of laws. We know that. You can read those in the first 5 books of the Bible. God was very specific. Do this, don't do that. Do this. When you do this, you're going to do it this way, at this time, and this is how many people are going to do it. Very specific. But God had given them an order on how to work this bread and how it was supposed to be eaten. It was dedicated for a religious purpose. It was dedicated for God, but yet, at this moment, there were some hungry men there that needed something to eat. They were in a tough spot, they were in a pickle, and they needed some sustenance. In giving these men bread, the priest, Ahimelech, was breaking the letter of the law. He was not supposed to let these men eat that bread, but he was not breaking the spirit of the law. And we'll see, God gave us the law, and he gave the Israelites, he said, don't do this, because I don't want you to get sick. And don't do that because this is you're set apart for me. And make sure you set this day aside. And you're going to pick up this much manna when it falls. And God gave Israel all these specific laws, but God didn't give those laws to Israel just because he wanted them to be programmed robots, just operating underneath such a specific set of rules. God was trying to help them see that he wanted them to live a life that was higher above just minute rules. He wanted them to live guided by the spirit of the law and what the law was pointing to. What was the law pointing to? It was pointing to Christ, right? And the law, everything about the law was pointing towards holiness and pointing towards a higher way of living. But in Jesus' day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests, they were so caught up in just following the letter of the law and following every minute detail, and they missed the bigger picture. We know that because when Jesus himself, the Messiah, the promised one, was there, they had nothing to do with him. They were so entrenched with the letter of the law that they were not accepting the finisher of the law, Jesus Christ. So what happened here is Ahimelech, yes, he broke the law, but he didn't break the spirit of the law. Insomuch that when Jesus was on earth, he points back to this reference. Turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. Jesus talks about this exact instance when he's here on earth. We're going to see that in this time, we're going to Mark chapter 2, Jesus does this and such. And the Pharisees say, oh, you can't do that. The law says you can't do that. Jesus, you healed a man. You said pick up his bed. It's the Sabbath day. You're not supposed to work. Jesus, you said you were supposed to be clean. We're supposed to be sanctified. We're supposed to have washing hands. Your disciples are eating without washing hands. And it seemed like everywhere Jesus tried to do something good, the Pharisees were right there. So here we have another one of those instances. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. And it came to pass that when he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began, as they went, to pluck ears of corn. The Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had a need, and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread, which is not lawful to eat but for the priests, and gave also to them that were with him. This is the principle that Jesus is trying to teach them in verse 27 and 28. He saith unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. David ate because he had a need. Was David supposed to eat the showbread according to the letter of the law? No, but according to the spirit of the law, absolutely. Jesus is trying to teach here that human need, the need for the gospel, the need for a hand up, the need for us to be a shining light to those around us, comes before religious ritual and before ceremonial law. I'll give you a perfect example. A few weeks back, or a couple months back now, we're out to eat with someone, and he wouldn't mind me sharing this. We were out to eat with the Browns. And Josh Brown and I were chatting, and he was asking me some questions. And after the meal, he had to go right to work. He works at the International Bar down there, right across from, right by the flower shop there in town. And I had some literature. I told him, I want to bring you. I got this book and I got this pamphlet I think could be a help to you in a couple different areas. And I got back to my office. I was going over my notes for Sunday night church, and the Lord just impressed to me, don't wait to give him those booklets next week like you promised him. Go give those to him right now. They could be a help. For whatever reason, the Holy Spirit was prompting me to do that. So I grabbed those books and I got in my car and I drove to where he was working. He was working at a bar. I've made a commitment that I'm not going to frequent bars. The Bible talks very specifically about not drinking alcoholic beverages, abstaining from appearances of evil, all those kinds of things. So you're not going to see me, generally, my Chevy Silverado parked at the International having a burger with the boys watching a game. It's just not what I do, generally. But in that instance, the Holy Spirit said, you need to give this to him right now. So I took the book and I walked into the bar. And I was dressed just like this, and I clearly was an outsider when I walked in. And I said, hey, here's the stuff I was talking about. I hope it can be a help. Have a good day at work. And I left. Was I breaking the letter of the law? Possibly. But was I breaking the spirit of the law? Absolutely not. Because the needs of man The spiritual needs of man far supersede the letter of the law. And that's the lesson that we're trying to teach here. The Lord gave me another perfect example yesterday. Tucker and I are walking down by the marina. I take him fishing. Take a little rod, and you can catch a lot of nice rock bass and smallmouth bass and stuff. And those of you who know what the marina is like down there, you know the whole marina is circled by a sidewalk that has that orange steel beam that's painted orange. And the rule is the kids can walk on the sidewalk, but they don't touch or walk on the orange beam. That keeps them at least a foot away from the edge. So we're walking along, and Tucker, of course, he's starting to get smart enough to where he thinks he has an option to obey. So he'll get up there and he'll put his toes right on, the orange. I slap him in the head. Don't touch the orange. Takes a step back, and we're making some casts, and he, right at the orange line, right? The spirit of the law that I was telling him is, I don't want him to fall in and drown, okay? The letter of the law is, yes, don't touch the orange, but it's a lot bigger principle than just don't touch the orange. So we get down a little bit further. There's a spot where the brake wall had broken. I think maybe Jack had been working on it because it wasn't. And they had welded it together. They had a metal plate on top where two pieces had broken apart. They had welded it, and that weld was rusted. There was no orange for like a 2-foot section. Tucker is standing with half of his feet over the edge of this. I'm making a cast. I look over, and I see this kid literally balancing over the edge. I slapped him in front of the head to knock him back this way. What are you doing, dude? He said, Dad, it's not orange. According to the letter of the law, he was not wrong, right? I said, don't touch the orange. He wasn't on the orange. But the spirit of the law, he was breaking big time. And that's where we get as believers. Say, God, what can I get away with? God says, don't do this, and we try to push the limits when the whole spirit of the law is so much greater than that. God says, I want you to live holy. I want you to be like me. I want you to be a light to the lost. And that is so much further above the law. And Jesus didn't come to destroy the law. He came to fulfill the law. And so many people now, they say, well, we don't need the Old Testament because Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. He did. Paul said it was his schoolmaster. And Jesus, in Matthew, you have Matthew chapter 5, you have the Beatitudes, and then after that, you have the passage that I like to call the "But I say unto you" passage. Jesus takes 6 different instances where he says, this is what the law said to do, but now that you're under grace, you don't get to backslide. You need to step it up, and you need to do a little bit better. The law said, don't kill a man. I say, if you have hate in your mind and in your heart, you've already committed murder. The law says not to touch a woman, but I say, if you even think and lust after her, that you've already committed adultery. So Jesus, in the spirit of the law, is asking us to live a higher standard of living. The spirit of the law is so that we can live a spirit-filled, Christ-led life. That is the law. So the first lesson that we learn here is to follow the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Not looking at the law and saying, what can I get away with? Or for the Lundins, if you're listening to it, with what can I get away? That still ends in a preposition. It doesn't matter. They're not here. It doesn't matter. But here you have Jesus says, abstain from all appearance of evil. Jesus is sitting with a woman who's a prostitute, giving her the gospel. Says, don't work on the Sabbath. But Jesus heals a man and says, pick up your bed and walk. It says, you're supposed to be clean. You're supposed to wash yourself, cleanse your hands. Why are your disciples eating with unwashed hands? Jesus isn't rebelling against the law. He is realizing that the needs of man far supersede the letter of the law. We have 3 more lessons, but I want to point out something. It's not really a lesson, just kind of a notice in the passage. We have a man whose name is Doeg, D-O-E-G. We'll see him in verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. He was somebody in Saul's kingdom there. Doeg is going to betray David and the priest Ahimelech. Notice if you were to flip forward to chapter 22, verse 6, When Saul heard that David was discovered and that the men were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having a spear in his hand. Guy is disturbed. He always has a spear in his hand. He's a terrible spear thrower, but he's always got it, right? And having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him, and then said Saul unto his servants that stood about him, Hear ye now, ye Benjamites, with the sons of Jesse. Will the sons of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me, and there is none that show me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or show unto me that my son hath stirred up my servants against me, to lie in wait at this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite. Doeg here, he sees an opportunity. Ooh, if I help betray David, and help betray the priest, I'm going to have a position in the kingdom. I'm going to make Saul happy here. Verse 9, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. It's no secret at this point that Saul is completely going against God. If you're helping Saul, you are going against God. And all the other servants, they wouldn't, we'll see a little bit later, Saul said, do this. And the servants of Saul, they wouldn't do it because it was so blasphemous, it was so wicked. But here we have a man who's willing to betray God's man, willing to betray God's anointed, to have a little bit more position in the kingdom. In fact, if you were to turn to Psalm 52, we have an entire psalm dedicated to this man's betrayal. Psalm 52. When you get there, maybe in your Bible it'll actually have maybe a little superscription above it. It says, the chief musician, a psalm of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. Listen to David's psalm, Psalm 52. Why boasteth thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. The tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever, because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Here, that is a psalm written about this man who betrayed him. And what I want to point out about this man, Doeg, is in betraying God's anointed and betraying God's man, this action was going to take him to a place that he would have never thought for himself, he would never have wanted for himself. He is going to be the king's hand in doing some very wicked, terrible things here in the next chapter. We're going to touch on those, but just keep that in mind. Lesson number 2. I need to get back over here to 1 Samuel. Lesson number 2. First of all, we said we need to follow the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Secondly, the King of Kings business does not require haste. Look at verse 8 of chapter 21. David said unto Ahimelech, Is there not here under thy hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. Remember, David is speaking he's falsely representing. He's saying, I'm on the king's business. It required haste. I didn't have anything to eat. That's why I'm asking you for bread. I didn't have time to grab a weapon. That's why I'm asking for anything to protect myself. But often I have heard this last phrase of this verse misquoted. The king's business requires haste. Hey man, you're really killing yourself this week out at church. Well, the king's business requires haste. The king's business does not require haste. Sometimes we've been taught or maybe pointed to think that if we're not packing our schedule so full to the max and running around like chickens with our heads cut off, doing things for the Lord, and we don't fall to bed every night exhausted from a ridiculous schedule of quote-unquote serving God, that we are backslidden. That is not true. Think about it. David did not have what he needed because he was in haste, right? Quite the opposite. We say the king's business required haste, but David was asking for food and for a weapon because he was in a hurry. And so the haste makes waste, that's what Miss Kim would say when she erased all my words out of my paste and made me rewrite them again. And But also here we see that David here was misrepresenting the king's business. The King of Kings' business doesn't require haste. We ought to be in service for God. It's the greatest work. Tonight we're going to look at a message called Consider the Work of God out of Ecclesiastes. The Solomon says, consider the work of God. It's the greatest work. It's the best work that you could ever do. Time spent in service for the Lord is not a waste of time. When we get to time and eternity and we look back onto our life, we really will see that that's what actually mattered. And I've had the opportunity to sit at a lot of people's deathbeds just by going with my dad a lot of times as a teenager, and then now being in full-time ministry for almost 8 years. Never heard anybody say, I wish I would have taken the boat out one more time. I wish I would have worked 40 more billable hours. I wish I would have done one more project. But often you hear them say, man, I wish I would have plugged into church a little more. I wish I would have gotten saved sooner. I wish I would have realized this. Things for the Lord matter. So I'm not saying don't do things for the Lord, okay? I'm preaching literally to the choir right now about don't feel like packing your schedule full of things and neglecting your own spirituality, your own health, your own family because you're doing things for the Lord. That's not spirituality. There's the flip side, and some of you just need to get off your lazy spiritual rear ends and start doing something for the Lord, okay? I'm not preaching to you, yeah, that's right, I need to lay off a little bit. I've been killing it. No, you haven't. You've been lazy, and you need to get your duff in gear, okay? So there's both sides of the spectrum here. But what we're seeing here is the king's business doesn't require haste. God does not work quickly and chaotically. Usually he works slowly and methodically. And in my life, I've seen it over and over again where we say, God, here's a problem I need to fix right now. And God says, I've got it all under control. I'm going to fix it. But it's not going to be right now. Because with God, timing is more important than time. His timing, His time, His way, His work is more important. I want to encourage you with that. Principle number 3. God's provision is found in the obstacles of life. God's provision is found in the obstacles of life. Look at verse 9. David's looking for a bite to eat and something to protect himself with. The priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. And David said, there is none like that. Give it me. When David faced the giant, there were several things that it obviously meant in his life. All right. First of all, it was an impossible obstacle. When David said, is anybody going to shut this guy up? He's defying the armies of the living God. Is anybody going to go out and kill this guy? And he went to Saul and said, hey, your servant, I'll go kill him for you. And Saul said, don't go kill him. You're just a youth. This man's been a warrior since his youth. Goliath was, with the shoes on, 10 feet tall. David, even if he was an exceptional young man, was 3.5 feet shorter than this guy. Goliath was probably pushing 1,000 pounds, especially with all of his armor. And David was nowhere near that. Goliath had a guy that just carried his shield. And then he had his coat of mail that weighed 120 pounds. And he had his spear that just the head weighed 15, 16 pounds. And he had another backup weapon. And he had his sword. And he was just an imposing, incredible man. Then you have David, who has a shepherd's staff and a couple of rocks and a sling. It was literally the ultimate David versus Goliath, right? It's like the original David versus Goliath. David goes out there. It was an impossible obstacle, but also God then gave him an improbable victory. He said, you come to me with the sword and the spear. I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. And everyone's going to see your camp, my camp, everybody's camp's going to see that there is a God in Israel. So it was an impossible obstacle, an improbable victory, and then it exalted David to position. David was a nobody. At the very beginning of David's career, we have the lineup, right? We've talked about it. And we have all of Jesse's sons. And Samuel says, you got any other kids? His dad didn't even call him in when the man of God was coming to pick out a king because he thought there's no way David's going to be considered. And he said, yeah, I got one more. Go grab him. We'll see. But if you didn't like these guys, you're definitely not going to like him. He brought him in. Samuel anointed him. And from the very beginning, David was kind of not on anybody's radar. But then he becomes the anointed king of Israel. He begins to play for Saul because he was a skilled musician. He was a mighty warrior. He becomes Saul's armor bearer. And now he's killed the Israel's greatest enemy. Now all of a sudden, Saul says, Saul was always looking to do things that was beneficial to him. And Saul said, since this guy is standing in front of me, this kid, he's holding Goliath's head in his hands, big old sweaty beard and big long hair, and he's standing there and said, hey, whatever you want me to do, sir, I'll do it. Saul said, it's probably going to make me look good if I put this kid over all my armies. So now David is literally over the entire army of the nation of Israel. David behaved himself wisely. He becomes the most important man in the nation. That opportunity, that obstacle that was in front of him now has exalted David into position. Now he's on everybody's radar. He was always on God's radar, but now he's on everyone's radar. But there was something else about Goliath that David probably, and really no one else really would have ever thought that God was using Goliath for, but we see it here. He was using Goliath for David's future provision and protection. David, when he left on his flight from Saul, he could have brought his sling and his staff. I mean, a sling you fit right in your pocket, right? And a couple of rocks. That's what he used to kill the giant. So why, when David left, didn't he have a weapon with him? Why didn't he just throw his sling in his pocket? He could have brought any spear, any sword, anything with him. He was waiting for Jonathan to come give him the news. He probably had a pretty good idea that he was going to get the word that he needed to run, that Saul was trying to kill him. He could have, remember, I think last week we were talking about how Jonathan was there with the bow and the arrows. He could have just asked Jonathan for his bow and arrows to take with him, right? David could have taken any weapon with him, but he didn't. Why? Because God had provided him the ultimate tool for his provision, for his protection. When God prepares you for what lies ahead in your life, by bringing you through a trial, the preparation will be like none other. When God's bringing you through a trial, it's not fun. When whatever it is going on, you think, this stinks. I don't like this. But notice what David said at the end of verse 9. There is none like that. Give it me. I would imagine that sword was so unique, just in size, let alone decoration. It was one of a kind. God had it set, wrapped up, laying there waiting for him. And David had no idea that when he pulled that sword out of Goliath's sheath, standing out there in that field, and lopped his head off, that sword was going to come into play again in his life when he was running from the very king that he was serving at the time. What once caused David to tremble in fear was now his greatest asset. Can you imagine how intimidating and imposing Goliath looked with that sword strapped to his side? How big and muscular and weather-worn his skin was. He had all that armor on, all that weaponry. He had that sword that who knows how long it was, 5, 6, 7 feet long. He's standing there hollering at the nation of Israel, I defy the armies of God, send me a man. And David runs out there, and I have to imagine, even though he went out there with 100% faith that God was going to deliver him, there had to be some level in the back of his mind of thinking, this could go really bad. This guy could just absolutely crush me. And by looking at him, he probably knew that it wouldn't be a long, drawn-out death. He'd probably just kill him pretty fast. But David had to be looking at him and thinking, God, you better be helping me. You better guide this stone because I'm only going to get one shot here. When David was looking at him, And you're looking at that sword and looking at the giant. That was a cause for fear. That was an impossible obstacle. But now David has that sword on his side. And now it's his greatest strength. He's thinking, boy, I can whoop anybody with this thing. God provided him exactly what he needed. And it was so much better than anything that he would have brought with him. You may say, I don't want to go through this. I don't want to go through this cancer treatment. I don't want to go through the loss of whoever it is, my mom and dad, my brother or sister, my children. I don't want to go through this being fired and this turmoil of I don't know where I'm going to work, how I'm going to provide. I don't want to go through this move. I don't want to go through this financial difficulty. I don't want to go through this injustice or these things, this hurt and the harm and the heartache that happened to me at a young age or has continued to happen. I don't want to go through this. But God knows that you're going to need to draw from that in the future. Don't get bitter at it. And one day you'll look back and say, there's really no preparation like that. Give it to me. I'm going to draw on that now in this time. Lastly, lesson number 1, we ought to live by the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. The King of Kings business doesn't require haste. Trust him. The Bible says to wait on the Lord. That doesn't mean to sit on your hands and say, God, what are you doing? The word wait is like a waitress or a waiter. It means to serve him until he tells you what to do next. Get busy serving God and he'll show you what's next. God's provision is found in life's obstacles. And lastly, the end of jealousy and pride is ugly. Look at verse, we're in chapter 21. Look at verse 11. The king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub. This is right after, wait, am I in the wrong spot? Is this chapter 22? I think this is chapter 22. This is after Doeg tattles on David and the priest. And King Saul figures out what's going on here. He figures out who he thought betrayed him. He thought it was the priest that betrayed him. The priest had no idea what was going on. And we're going to pick up the story here, verse 11. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house. The priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. Whenever you're in the presence of the man of God or in the presence of God, you ought to be the one listening. But now King Saul said, You listen here. I'm going to tell you what. This did not turn out well when you're telling God what's going to go on. Never turns out good. Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Hear, my lord. And he said unto him, Why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, hast inquired of God for him that he should rise against me to lie in wait as at this day? Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, Who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thy house? The priest is confused. He has no idea what's going on here. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto this servant, nor to all the house of thy father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. But Saul doesn't listen to reason. He's in such a fit of rage at this point. Verse 16, the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. We're talking about the priests. Saul is so angry because he thought that the priest went behind his back and helped David escape, that now he's going to kill God's man. Verse 17, the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priest of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not show it to me. Notice this, but the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priest of the Lord. They were smarter. They knew that disobeying the king could cause the king to kill him, especially when he was in this fit of rage, but they were willing to risk it because they were not going to put their hand against the Lord. They had watched the nation of Israel do that time and time and time again, and they were willing to face King Saul rather than face King Jesus. And the king said unto Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priests. Remember I said that with that greed that Doeg had of trying to maybe make himself move up the corporate ladder, so to speak, in the kingdom was going to take him somewhere he didn't want to be. He's there right now. The king said unto Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priest. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priest, and slew on that day 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod. Wowzers. 85 priests, 85 men of God. Doesn't stop there. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and ashes and sheep, and with the edge of the sword. And the one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. Saul does the unthinkable. He literally is spiraling out of control. He has slaughtered the entire city of God's men. Not a good place to be. Where did that start? Think, how do you get to that place when you're the first king of Israel, the king over God's people? How do you get to that place? Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verse 6. We're going to see exactly where it starts. We know where it ends. Where does it start? And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine. David and the men of Israel are coming back from the battle, a great victory. Goliath and the Philistines are no longer going to bother them. The women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more than the kingdom? And Saul eyed David. That means to look at with jealousy and anger from that day forward. Where did that slaying an entire town of God's men come from? It came from jealousy. It came from pride, and it came from anger. Do you struggle with jealousy, looking around at God's people and thinking, as our church grows, oh, so-and-so, they got promoted to a Sunday school teacher. Oh, so-and-so, they get to do this. Oh, they get to do that. Pastor asked them to do this and such. Why didn't they ask me? How come I've been here longer? I'm more talented at that than so-and-so is. That is the spirit that will take us down and sink this ship. Why? Because we have a perfect example of what happens when we have that attitude. In the list of things that God lists that he hates and are an abomination unto him, a proud look is one of them. Saul was definitely dealing with some pride. He was always putting himself above God. And we have those that sow discord among the brethren. Let's be careful as a church, as individuals, as families, that we don't look around with a jealous eye, saying, oh, how come he gets to do this? How come so-and-so gets to do that? It's not good. And it will take you to a place that you don't want to be. What were the principles that we learned today from David's flight? Follow the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. Now, that doesn't mean that we live a lower life and a lower standard. That, in fact, means that now that we're under grace, people say, oh, I can do this, I'm under grace. That actually means that we're supposed to take another notch up, knowing that everything that Jesus did for us. The king's business doesn't require haste. It requires us to wait on him. God's provision is found in life's obstacles. When he brings you through a trial, he is going to have something there, or some things in there that you're going to learn that is going to be critical for the next spot in your life. It's like your life is kind of like one of those escape rooms where you got to find the one piece before you can find the next one, and the next one, and the next one, which is ultimately to get out, right? And you can't find the one without the other. That's how God's will often works. You have to go through, God, why am I going through this trial? Because you got to learn something to help you go through the next thing. And then lastly, the end of jealousy, the end of pride is an ugly, ugly end. And it will take you far beyond where you ever want to go. So nip it in the bud when it's just a little weed. That root of bitterness, pluck it out before it grows into a big lawn full of dandelions. Those are the lessons from David's flight.